Hello children, and welcome to another maths lesson. Today we're going to be looking at the inverse of our last lesson. In our last lesson we learned how to multiply numbers by 100 to make numbers 100 times greater. Today we're going to be dividing by 100. We're going to be making numbers 100 times smaller, or we'll be seeing how many hundreds fit into a number. Let's use our base 10 again to help us to understand what we do when we divide by 100 or make something 100 times smaller. Let's start off with our 100. To divide by 100, we're going to divide it into 100 equal parts. We know from our use of our base 10 that we've got 100 ones in our 100. So to divide by 100, we divide by 10 and then 10 again. I know there are 100 ones in that 100. If we wanted to divide 1,000 by 100, just as before, we'd divide it by 10 and then 10 again. And we know 100 tens fit into that 1,000 cube. So you may have noticed multiplying by 100 is the inverse of dividing by 100. When we multiplied by 100, we moved each digit 2 spaces to the left. We multiplied by 10 and 10 again. To divide by 100, we move the digits 2 spaces to the right. We divide by 10 and we divide by 10 again. Let's do some calculations together. Let's work through the 4 calculations, starting with 2,800 divided by 100. So I'm going to make 2,800 on my place value grid. When we divide by 100, we're making the number 100 times smaller, or it also means how many hundreds fit into 2,800. How many hundreds can you see altogether? You might be able to use your previous place value knowledge to predict what you think the quotient will be. Let's try now by moving the digits 2 spaces to the right. This might be a little bit tricky because I've only got one pair of hands. So let's start off by dividing it by 10 first, so we just move each digit 1 space to the right. So the 2,000 moves into the hundreds, the 8 moves into the tens, the 0 moves into the ones, and this 0 can be removed. We've made it 10 times smaller so far. We've divided it by 10. We need to do the same again. The 200 becomes 2 tens, the 8 tens become 8 ones, and we can remove the 0. So our quotient is 28. 2,800 made 100 times smaller is 28. Moving on to the second calculation, 3,600 divided by 100. 3,600. We're going to divide it by 100. We're going to make it 100 times smaller. Can you predict how many hundreds do you think there are in 3,600? Let's move our digits. Just watch this time as I do it. Were you right? Did you get a quotient of 36? 3,600 divided by 100 gives us a quotient of 36. Let's try another one. 4,000 divided by 100. We're going to make 400 100 times smaller, or do you know how many hundreds are in this number already? Let's see. I'm going to move each digit to the right twice. Did you get it right? the quotient is 4. And our final one, 9,000 divided by 100. How many hundreds are going to fit into 9,000 altogether? Remember, we move each digit 2 spaces to the right. That's once, that's twice. 9,000 divided by 100 gives us a quotient of 90. We're going to end with the challenge now. Look at my equations here. They all involve dividing by 100. We already know the quotient, but the part we don't know is the dividend. So, I wonder whether you can work out what the dividend is. So if we look at the first one, we've started with a number and we've divided it by 100. Remember, when we divide a number by 100, each digit moves 2 spaces to the right. And the quotient is 57. So can you work out what our dividend was when it was made 100 times smaller? We've got 57. I wonder whether you know what you need to do to 57 to find the dividend. Have a think. Well, this has already been made 100 times smaller. To find the dividend, we need to do the inverse, the opposite. We need to make it 100 times greater. 10 times greater, 100 times greater. Can you remember what we have to do with these 2 spaces? We have to replace the spaces with zeros. So the dividend was 5,700. Look at the next 3 calculations and pause the video. See if you can work out what the dividend is for all 3. How did you get on? I've put the correct dividends here for you to see and you can check your learning. Let's go through each one now so we can see why these are the correct dividends. So we started with a quotient of 3, and to find the dividend I had to make it 100 times greater. Times 10 times 100, replace the spaces with a 0, and that's why the dividend was 300. Let's try the next one. So our quotient was 18. We had to find the dividend. So I need to do the inverse and I need to multiply it by 100. Multiply by 10, multiply it by 10 again, and we replace the spaces with zeros. And you can see that's why our dividend is now 1,800. Let's try the final one together. Our quotient was 41 and we needed to work out what the dividend was. I think you probably know what I'm going to do. Times it by 10, times it by 100. Where are my zeros? Here they are. Replace the spaces with the zeros. So my dividend was 4,100. I hope you found that useful again. Look at your home learning sheet to see what your learning is next. Work hard everybody and always use the place value grid if you find anything tricky. Bye bye.